The worst part wasn't seeing him again. The worst part was that Maisie had spent 3 years convincing herself she wouldn't care if she did. She had rehearsed it, in the quiet hours before dawn when the bakery ovens were still cold, and the only sound in her small rented room above the kitchen was the wind pressing against the warped wooden shutters. She had rehearsed the version of herself who would smile politely, nod once, and carry on. The version who had healed completely. The version who had stopped counting the days since he left without a word. Without even the decency of a letter. A message carried by runner. Anything. 2 years, 7 months, and 11 days. She had stopped counting. She set the clay pitcher of water down on the long table near the window and pressed her palm flat against the worn linen of her apron, steadying herself the way she always did before the midday rush at the Iron Lantern, the only proper dining hall in the border town of Veldrath, where wolves and humans shared uneasy meals and careful silences. Her hands smelled of rosemary and rendered fat. Her braid had come half loose at the nape of her neck. She had a small burn on her left wrist from where the ladle had slipped that morning, and she had not had time to wrap it properly. None of that mattered when she looked up and saw him walk through the door. Dorian Vale. He was taller than she remembered, or perhaps she had simply let herself forget the particular way he filled a doorframe. Broad-shouldered, dressed in fine wool the color of charcoal. His dark hair swept back from a face that had grown sharper with time. He looked like authority now. He looked like someone who had learned, in the years since Veldrath, how to wear power without apology. He was laughing at something the man beside him said. Maisie did not breathe. Behind her, one of the younger serving girls, a human girl named Petra, touched her elbow. Table 4 needs refilling. Maisie, are you... I see it, Maisie said. Her voice came out even. She was proud of that. She moved to the far side of the hall, keeping her back to the door, focusing on the grain of the wood beneath her fingertips, as she lifted a second pitcher and began to pour. The hall smelled of pine resin and tallow candles, and the slow-roasted mutton that had been turning on the spit since before sunrise. A fire burned in the great hearth at the far wall. Outside, the late autumn wind dragged dead leaves against the shuttered windows. She did not look at him. She did not need to. She could feel it. That particular prickling awareness at the back of her skull that had never fully faded. The way the air in a room changed when Dorian Vale entered it. She had always been too sensitive to things like that. Her grandmother had called it a gift. The elders of the small woodland pack she'd grown up in. Before her family lost everything. Before her father died and her older brother Corin disappeared into the Eastern Territories, had called it something less kind. The girl who feels too much. She was 24 years old, and she had been feeling too much her entire life. She made it through the first half hour by sheer will. She refilled drinks. She carried platters. She answered a question from old Fenwick about whether the kitchen still had sage bread, and she said yes, and she smiled, and her face did not crack. Not once. Then Petra appeared at her side again, this time with wide eyes and a folded piece of parchment. The gentleman at the new table near the window, Petra whispered. He asked for you specifically, said he knew you. Maisie looked at the note. Maisie. Please, 5 minutes. D. She folded it once and slid it into her apron pocket. Then she picked up a tray and walked toward his table. Because she was a professional, and because the alternative was walking out the back door and not stopping until she reached the forest, and she had done that once already in her life. She was finished running. Dorian stood when he saw her coming. He had always done that. Small courtesies, easy manners, the kind of charm that felt like sunlight until you understood it had no warmth behind it. Maisie. Her name in his mouth, after all this time. It felt like pressing a bruise. What can I bring you? She said. Not a question. Her eyes stayed at a level just past his left ear. I didn't come to eat. He shifted, and she noticed now that the man beside him was watching her with something calculated in his expression. Older. Wolf, she thought. Senior Wolf, by the weight of his scent even across the table. Pine and iron and old authority. a counselor of some kind, or a guard. I came because I need to speak with you, about your brother. Her eyes moved to his face before she could stop them. Corin. She had not heard that name spoken aloud in 14 months. My brother, she repeated very carefully, has been missing for over a year. I know. Dorian's voice dropped. That's why I'm here. She set the tray down on the nearest empty surface. Her hands were not shaking. She was very deliberate about that. You have 5 minutes, she said. I'll get your bread. She walked to the kitchen, pushed through the heavy door, and stood over the stone sink for a long moment with cold water running over the burn on her wrist. Her heart was loud in her ears. Corin. He knew something about Corin. She breathed in. Rosemary. Fat. Smoke. The smell of this small, ordinary life she had built on the edges of someone else's world. Then she dried her hands, cut 2 slices of sage bread, and went back out. Dorian waited until she had set the bread down before he leaned forward. The counselor beside him had gone still, with that specific stillness that high-ranking wolves adopted when they were listening to everything in a room at once. Your brother is alive, Dorian said. Maisie's breath left her body. He was taken, Dorian continued, voice low and urgent. Not lost, not wandering. Taken and held, at a holding estate in the Northern Ridge Territories. He's been there since last winter. He paused. There's a way to get him out. A petition, filed directly with the King's Court. Someone with the right standing could present it. Someone connected to the Pack territories through blood or documented lineage. He looked at her steadily. Someone like you, Maisie. Your father's bloodline traces back to the old Veldrath Pack covenant. That gives you standing, if you're willing to travel north and appear before the council. She stared at him. You're telling me my brother has been imprisoned for over a year, and the way to free him is for me to travel to the King's Court and beg. Not beg. Present a legal petition. It's different. And why? She said very quietly. Are you the one bringing me this information? After 3 years of silence? Something moved across his face. Discomfort, she thought. Or something close to it. Because I owe you that much, he said. It was not enough of an answer. She knew, in the deep place where she felt things too sharply, that it was not even close to being enough of an answer. But Corin's face was already rising in her memory. Her older brother, 28 years old, who had taught her to climb the oak trees behind their childhood cottage, and who had stayed up with her through 3 nights of fever when she was 12, pressing cold cloths to her forehead and reading badly aloud from whatever book came to hand. Alive. He was alive. Where would I stay? She asked. The Northern Ridge is 4 days' ride. I've arranged lodging, Dorian said quickly, and a letter of introduction, everything you'd need to reach the court and file the petition. I just need you to go, Maisie. And I need you to go soon. The council convenes in 9 days. 9 days. She looked at him for a long moment, at the familiar lines of his face, now older and stranger, at the counselor beside him, who had still not spoken, and whose eyes had not left her face since she sat down. She thought about what it meant that Dorian Vale, who had walked away from her without a word, had appeared in Veldrath with a ready answer to the only question that had kept her awake for 14 months. It was too clean. But Corin was alive. I'll need until morning, she said. Of course. Dorian almost smiled. Almost. You always were careful. She picked up her tray and walked away, and did not let herself think about the fact that careful had never once been enough to keep her safe from the things that mattered most. She did not sleep. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed with the single tallow candle burning low on the windowsill, and she thought about every reason not to trust Dorian Vale. And then she thought about Corin. And then she started over from the beginning. By the 3rd hour, the candle had burned to a stub, and the wind had picked up outside, dragging something loose across the rooftop with a hollow, rhythmic scraping. Maisie wrapped her wool blanket around her shoulders and sat very still, the way she had learned to sit when the feeling came. That pressure behind her sternum, that low and wordless knowing that something was wrong in a way she could not yet name. She had felt it the moment Dorian walked through the Iron Lantern's door. She had told herself it was only the shock of seeing him. Now, in the dark, she was less certain. She pulled the letter of introduction from her apron pocket. She had taken it from Dorian before leaving the table, studied it in the kitchen, then folded it into her pocket without comment. It was written on heavy parchment, the kind that cost more than a week of her wages, sealed with dark wax and stamped with a mark she did not fully recognize. A double ring design, like 2 circles crossed at the edge. She had seen something like it before, she was almost certain. In her father's old papers years ago, before everything was taken. She tilted it toward the dying candlelight and looked again. Border acquisition seal. Her father had warned her about those. She had been young, perhaps 14, and she had not understood why his voice went flat and careful when he explained it. Border acquisition was a legal mechanism used to contest land rights in the Outer Pact territories. It required a documented bloodline claim filed in person before the king's court. It was, he had said, the cleanest way powerful pacts swallowed smaller ones whole. You simply waited until the last surviving heir was in the room, had them sign or testify under council law, and then used their own words to dissolve whatever remained of their family's standing. Maisie stared at the seal until the candle went out entirely. In the dark, she was very quiet for a long time. Then she got up, dressed in her warmest things, the thick linen underdress, the heavy wool overdress the color of wet slate, her worn leather boots, the gray cloak that had belonged to her mother, and she packed the only bag she owned. She did not pack much. She had never owned much. A change of clothes, her mother's small bronze clasp, the 2 coins she had saved toward nothing in particular, and the letter, which she folded carefully and placed at the bottom beneath everything else. Evidence, she thought. Keep it. She left 2 weeks' rent on the table in an envelope for the landlord. She left a note for Petra that said only family emergency. Back when I can. Then she went down the back stairs and out through the kitchen courtyard into the cold pre-dawn dark of Veldrath. She was not going to the king's court. She was going to find the truth first. The town's only archive, a generous word for 3 shelves of territorial records kept in the back of the notary's office, opened at first light. Maisie was waiting on the step when the notary, a stooped human man named Aldrich, arrived with his ring of keys and a suspicious expression. I need to look at Border Covenant records, she said. Specifically the Veldrath Pack lineage filings from the last 30 years. He let her in without comment. He had known her father once. He did not ask questions. She found what she was looking for in less than an hour. The Veldrath Pack Covenant, registered 41 years ago, listed 6 founding bloodlines. One of them was her father's. The document was clear. If no living heir appeared before the king's court to reaffirm the claim within 3 years of the last registered holder's death, the land and title rights reverted to the nearest high-ranking pack with territorial adjacency. Her father had died 3 years and 2 months ago. She did a very slow calculation in her head. If she appeared before the king's court and testified, which was what Dorian's letter of introduction would have her do, framed as a petition for Corin's release, she would not be freeing her brother. She would be formally relinquishing the last of her family's covenant standing, in front of witnesses, under council law. The moment she spoke her name and bloodline aloud in that chamber, whatever remained of what her father had built would dissolve. And Corin, if he was even truly held somewhere, if that part was real and not another layer of the lie, would still be exactly where he was. She sat back in the creaking wooden chair and looked at the water-stained ceiling of the notary's office. Dorian had not come to help her. He had come to finish what someone had started 3 years ago, when her father died, and the pack scattered and the land went quiet, and everyone simply waited to see if there was anyone left worth maneuvering against. Apparently, there was. Apparently she was. She pressed both hands flat on the table and breathed through the tightness in her chest. She would not fall apart here, in a notary's office that smelled of old paper and candle wax and damp wood. She would not give whatever plan this was the satisfaction of her collapse. She asked Aldrich for a blank sheet of parchment and copied down the exact covenant terms by hand, including the clause about heir reaffirmation. Then she folded the copy inside her cloak. She walked out into the morning. The road north out of Veldrath split at the ridge marker, left toward the King's Court, right toward the border territories proper. Maisie stood at the split for a moment, her cloak pressed flat against her by the wind, her braid already coming loose, and then she turned right. She did not have a plan. She had information, a letter she would not be using, and a brother who was supposedly imprisoned somewhere in the Ridge territories. The sensible thing would have been to go back, to find someone with legal knowledge, to wait. She had been waiting for 3 years. She had been sensible her entire life, and it had cost her everything, one piece at a time. She walked. By midday, she had covered 8 miles of hard road, moving through stands of pine and bare-branched ash, the ground frozen solid underfoot, the sky the color of pewter and pressing low. She stopped once to drink from a stream, her reflection fractured and pale on the moving water. She barely recognized the face looking back at her, hollow-eyed from a sleepless night. Jaw set, the kind of stillness that came not from calm, but from having run out of room to panic. She was 6 miles past the ridge marker when she heard the horses. Not one horse. Several, moving fast, and moving toward her from behind. She stepped off the road instinctively, pressing into the tree line, and watched through the branches as 2 riders crested the slope behind her, and then pulled up short when they saw the empty road. She recognized the counselor from the Iron Lantern, the older wolf who had sat beside Dorian and said nothing. He had not been silent because he had nothing to say. He had been silent because he was watching her leave so he would know which road to follow. The second rider was someone she did not know, larger, armed by the shape of what hung at his belt. She pressed deeper into the trees. The counselor said something low to his companion. They split, one staying on the road, one turning toward the tree line on the opposite side. Maisie moved without making a decision about it. She simply moved, angling through the trees, keeping low, keeping quiet, her boots finding the soft frozen moss between the roots rather than the crackle of dead leaves. She had grown up in forest. She had played in woods like these before she could read. She knew how to move through trees without becoming part of the noise. She moved for a long time. When she finally stopped, breath ragged, hands pressed to a wide pine trunk, the sound of the horses was distant, then gone. She was deep in the ridge forest now, off any road she knew. The light was beginning to thin at the edges, the short autumn afternoon collapsing toward dusk faster than she had expected. The temperature was dropping with the light, and her cloak, heavy wool as it was, had not been made for forest floor cold. She needed shelter. She needed, more urgently, to understand that she had just run from armed men who had been sent to find her, and that going back to Veldrath was no longer safe, and that she had no allies in any direction she could name. She leaned her back against the pine and looked up through the bare branches at the gray sky. Then the sound came. Not horses. Something larger. Something moving through the trees to her left with a steadiness that was not hurried and not frightened. The deliberate, unhurried movement of something that did not need to run, because nothing in this forest would make it. She went completely still. A wolf stepped out from between 2 ash trees. Black, enormous. Its eyes, catching the last pale light, were a pale, clear gray, almost silver, and they looked at her with an intelligence that had nothing animal in it. It stopped 6 feet away. It did not growl. It did not advance. It simply stood in the cold air between the trees and looked at her with those calm gray eyes. And Maisie, who had spent her whole life feeling things she could not explain, felt something shift in the deepest part of her chest. Not fear. Something she had no name for. The wolf lowered itself slowly to the frozen ground, tucked its great dark head onto its forepaws, and waited, as if it intended to stay until she was ready to move. She did not move for a long time. The wolf did not move either. That was the strangest part. Not its size, not the intelligence in its eyes, Not the fact that it had emerged from the trees with the quiet certainty of something that had been looking for her specifically. The strangest part was the stillness. Maisie had encountered wolves before, both shifted and in their animal form, and they were never still like this. They were restless, watchful, always carrying some low current of tension beneath the surface. This one lay on the frozen ground with its great head on its forepaws, and breathed slowly, as though it had nowhere else to be, and no concern in the world except to remain exactly where it was. She kept her back to the pine tree. The bark was rough through her cloak, grounding. "I'm not going to pretend I'm not afraid of you," she said, because silence felt more dangerous than speaking. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "But I'm also not going to run, if that's what you're waiting for." The wolf lifted its head and looked at her. "I have nowhere particularly safe to run to," she added. "So." Something shifted in those gray eyes. If she had been the kind of person who let herself believe impossible things, she might have called it acknowledgement. Then the wolf rose, turned, and walked 3 paces deeper into the trees. It stopped, looked back at her. She understood the gesture. She was not sure whether that understanding frightened her or not. She pushed off from the pine tree and followed. It led her for nearly a mile through the darkening forest, moving at a pace she could match, never getting so far ahead that she lost sight of the black shape between the trees. The cold had settled completely now, the kind that got into the joints and stayed, and Maisie's breath came in small, white clouds that dissolved into the dark air around her. She focused on the sound of her own boots on the frozen ground, and did not think about armed riders or covenant seals or the particular expression on Dorian's face when he'd said, "I owe you that much," as though debt were the same thing as decency. The trees thinned. A structure appeared, a hunting lodge, long and low, built from dark timber with a stone foundation, and a chimney from which a thin thread of smoke was rising. Firelight in the single front window. A horse tied under the shelter of the eave, already blanketed against the cold. The wolf stopped at the tree line. Maisie stopped beside it. The lodge door opened before she could decide anything. A man stepped out onto the narrow porch, and even in the poor light, even with the distance between them, she felt the change in the air the same way she always felt things, before her mind had caught up with her instincts. He was tall, dark-haired, with long braids pulled back from a face that was all sharp angles and careful attention. He wore a leather chest harness over a dark tunic and a fur-lined cloak across his shoulders, and he moved with the particular economy of someone who had spent a long time learning not to waste motion. He looked at her across the clearing with pale gray eyes. The same gray she had just been looking into, she realized, with a jolt that went straight through her sternum. The wolf at her side exhaled slowly. Then it was simply gone. Not fled, not retreated, simply no longer there. The space beside her was empty. The man on the porch had not moved. "You're cold," he said. Not a question. His voice was low and even, carrying easily across the clearing without effort. "There's a fire. You're welcome to it." Maisie did not move. "I don't know you." "No," he agreed. "You were following me. Your wolf was following me." A pause. "My wolf was making certain you didn't freeze to death in the ridge forest alone after dark," which seemed like a reasonable precaution given the circumstances. "And what circumstances are those?" He looked at her for a moment. "2 armed men were tracking you on the North Ridge Road. I redirected them." He said it the way someone might say I moved the furniture, as a simple fact, without decoration. "You can come inside or you can stand in the cold and distrust me from a distance. I won't force either outcome." She stood in the cold for another full minute. Then she walked toward the lodge, because she was practical above all things, and because the temperature was dropping fast enough that principle was becoming a luxury she could not afford. The inside of the lodge was sparse and clean. A long table, 2 chairs, a fireplace with a good blaze already built, a wool blanket folded over the back of a chair. Maps on the table, held flat at the corners by an ink pot, a compass, and a short-handled knife. The room smelled of wood smoke and pine resin and leather, And underneath that, something else. A clean, cold scent like air before snowfall that she couldn't quite place. The man followed her inside and stayed near the door, leaving the space of the room between them. He did not move to close the distance. He simply stood, his cloak across his arm now, and let her look around without comment. She looked at the maps first. Northern Ridge territories, clearly marked. Border lines she recognized from the Covenant records she had copied that morning. And there, circled in dark ink, a location on the far eastern edge of the ridge, labeled in a hand she did not know. Holt Crossing. Active holding. Her throat tightened. What is that? He looked where she was looking. A private estate that has been operating outside council oversight for approximately 14 months. His tone did not change. Used primarily for holding individuals whose presence is inconvenient to certain parties with territorial interests. 14 months. The same length of time Corin had been gone. She turned to look at the man directly for the first time. Who are you? He met her eyes without hesitation. Caius. The name landed with a weight she didn't immediately understand. Then her mind caught up with her instincts, the way it always did slightly too late, and she went very still. Caius. She had never seen him before. She had never been anywhere near the King's Court, or the High Territories, or any of the places where his name would have been spoken aloud in her presence. But she knew the name the way everyone in the Pact Territories knew it, not from meetings or ceremonies, but from the low, careful way adults said it when they thought children weren't listening. From the particular silence that followed it in rooms full of wolves. The Alpha King. She took one step back, purely by reflex. Something moved across his face. Not offense, not amusement. Something quieter than either. I'm not going to ask you to kneel, he said. Or to be less afraid. Both seem unreasonable given the evening you've had. She stared at him. Why are you in a hunting lodge on the Northern Ridge? Because the Northern Ridge is where my investigation has led me, he said simply. There is a network of illegal holding arrangements operating across the border territories. I've been tracing it for 7 months. It leads, consistently, back to a group of senior Pact counselors who have been using border acquisition law to quietly absorb smaller Pact territories. He paused. Your family's Covenant land is the most recent target. Maisie felt the shape of it click together in her mind. All the pieces she had collected since the previous night, arranging themselves into a pattern that was worse and also cleaner than she had imagined. Dorian Vale, she said. Is a collector, Caius said. Someone who locates surviving heirs and delivers them to the people who need their testimony. He has done it 4 times before you. His voice remained level. He is not the origin of this. He is a tool of it. And my brother is being held at Holt Crossing. I have confirmation of that from 2 independent sources. He looked at her steadily. He is alive, and he has not been harmed. He is leverage, kept available in case direct coercion of the heir became necessary. She sat down in the nearest chair without deciding to. Her legs had simply made that choice for her. She pressed both hands flat on her knees and looked at the fire and thought about Corin, 28 years old, held somewhere in a stone building on the eastern ridge for 14 months because she was the heir, and he was the way to move her. I copied the Covenant terms this morning, she said, her voice coming out distant and even. Before I left Veldrath. I have the document. A brief silence. That was careful thinking. It means I haven't relinquished anything yet. They needed me in front of the council to do it legally. She looked up at him. So they have no legal ground yet. Correct. Which means there's still time to file a counterclaim. An heir reaffirmation, rather than a dissolution. If I appeared before the council myself, with documented evidence of the illegal holding arrangement, with Corin present. She stopped. That requires getting Corin out first. Caius looked at her for a moment, with those gray eyes that had been watching her. She now understood, since well before the forest. Yes, he said. It does. She looked back at the fire. The logs shifted and settled, sending a brief shower of sparks up the chimney. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a long, low sound like breathing. She had come north with nothing. No plan, no allies, no certainty beyond the knowledge that she would not let herself be used. And somehow she had ended up in a hunting lodge on the ridge with the Alpha King, a circled location on a map, and the precise shape of everything that had been done to her family laid out in plain language. She did not trust him yet. She was not sure trust was something she had left in any quantity. But she understood, with the same instinct that had never once steered her wrong, even when she'd refused to listen to it, that the man standing across this firelit room was not Dorian Vale. He had not promised her anything easy. He had not smiled to put her at ease. He had given her information and left her to draw her own conclusions, and he had stayed near the door. "Tell me," she said finally, "what getting him out would require." Caius moved to the table, turned the map so she could see it clearly, and began to talk. She listened to every word. She did not sleep that night either, but it was a different kind of wakefulness. In Veldrath, the sleeplessness had been made of dread, the circular, airless kind that fed on itself and produced nothing. Here, in the narrow back room of the hunting lodge, where Caius had wordlessly indicated she could rest, she lay on a cot with a wool blanket and a second one folded at her feet and stared at the low timber ceiling, with her mind moving in straight lines for the first time in years. She could hear him on the other side of the wall, not pacing. He did not seem like a man who paced, just present. The occasional sound of a chair shifting, the soft drag of parchment across the table, the quiet of someone who was also awake and also working, and did not require silence to be acknowledged. She had studied the map for 2 hours before he suggested she rest. She had asked questions, specific, practical ones, and he had answered each of them without impatience and without the faint condescension she had braced for. He had shown her the approach routes to Holt Crossing, the guard rotation schedules his sources had compiled, the location of the holding rooms in the eastern wing. He had explained that his 2 outriders, wolves she had not seen but whose presence she had registered as a faint shift in the air outside, had been watching Holt Crossing for 3 days. "Why?" she had asked at one point. "Why does the Alpha King involve himself personally in a border territory dispute over a minor pack covenant?" He had been quiet for a moment. Not evasive. Thinking, she had decided. There was a difference, and she was learning to read it in him, faster than she would have expected. "Because 4 families before yours lost everything to this arrangement," he said. "And I was 2 months too late each time. I am not willing to be late again." She had looked at him across the map and found nothing in his face that suggested performance. No calculated earnestness, no charm deployed for effect. Just a flat, clear statement of intention from a man who seemed entirely comfortable with the weight of what he was carrying. She did not say anything else about it, but she had thought about it for the rest of the evening. They left before first light. Caius rode. Maisie rode the second horse, a steady gray mare that had been waiting under the eave, prepared, she understood, before he found her. He had known she was in the forest before his wolf led her out of it. She filed that away without comment. His 2 outriders materialized from the trees as they reached the road. Both wolves, both in human form, both armed and moving with the same quiet economy she had come to associate with Caius himself. He introduced them only as Brennan and Fife. They acknowledged her with brief nods and asked no questions. She appreciated that more than she could easily say. The ride to Holt Crossing took most of the morning. The road climbed steadily into the eastern ridge, the pines growing denser and darker, the frost heavier on every surface. They spoke little. Caius rode slightly ahead, and she found herself watching the set of his shoulders against the gray sky, the particular stillness he carried even in motion, as though the world's turbulence simply did not reach him. She thought about Dorian, about the way she had once interpreted his easy manner as strength, when it had in fact been the opposite. the smoothness of someone who had never needed to develop anything deeper because charm had always been sufficient. She thought about the 3 years she had spent in Veldrath, remaking herself into someone practical and contained and self-sufficient, and how the sight of him in a doorway had still, for one unguarded moment, made her forget everything she had rebuilt. She was finished with that. Whatever shape grief had taken over Dorian Vale, she had buried it in the notary's office the moment she understood what the border acquisition seal meant. What remained was something cleaner and harder. Not hatred. She did not have the energy for hatred, simply a closed door. Ahead, Caius slowed his horse and raised one hand. Everyone stopped. He turned in the saddle and looked at her, his voice dropping to carry only as far as she was. The estate is a 1/4 mile through those trees. The eastern holding wing is here. He indicated a point on the small folded map he drew from his cloak. Ground floor, 3 rooms, iron-barred windows. Brennan and Fife will approach from the north to draw the guards to the main gate. That gives us a window of approximately 8 minutes on the eastern side. Us, she said. You know your brother's face. My men do not. He said it simply. And you have the right to be the one who walks through that door. She looked at him for a moment. He had just handed her the thing she most needed and framed it as logic rather than generosity. She was not sure whether that made it easier or harder to accept. 8 minutes, she said. 8 minutes. She folded the map and put it in her cloak. Then we shouldn't waste time. The eastern wall of Holt Crossing was old stone, dark with moisture, the mortar crumbling at the lower courses. She and Caius moved along the tree line to the point where the coverage brought them within 30 feet of the wall, and then they crossed the open ground fast and low, reaching the shadow of the stone without sound. She could hear, distantly, Brennan and Fife creating precisely the kind of disturbance at the main gate that would pull every available guard toward the front of the estate. Shouting. The crash of something large being overturned. Then the specific resonant sound of a shifted wolf slamming into timber, a sound she had heard twice in her life and never forgotten. Caius found the eastern door in 12 seconds. The lock was iron and old. He produced a short tool from his belt, worked it in silence for a moment, and the door opened. The corridor inside was narrow and dark, and smelled of damp stone and old tallow. She did not let herself stop to absorb it. She moved. 3 doors, iron bars at the small window of each. She looked through the first, empty. The second, a man she did not know, asleep on a cot. The third, Corin. He was sitting on the floor with his back against the far wall, his knees drawn up, his head down. He was thinner. His hair had grown long and his clothes were worn through at the elbows. But the line of his shoulders, the particular way he held himself even in exhaustion, she would have known him anywhere, in any condition, in any darkness. Corin, she said. His head came up. The expression that crossed his face was something she knew she would carry for the rest of her life. A shattering and a remaking, happening simultaneously, in the space of one breath. Maisie. His voice was wrecked and quiet. Maisie, how... Later, she said, because Caius was already working the door lock, and she could hear the disturbance at the front gate shifting, the guards beginning to reorganize. We have about 4 minutes. Corin was on his feet, before the door finished swinging open. She caught him by the arm as he came through, steadying his first steps. He was unsteady, she noted, from disuse and poor food. And then he straightened, and he was Corin again, all stubbornness and survival. And he looked past her at Caius with the instinctive wariness of a wolf who had spent 14 months learning to trust no one. He's with me, Maisie said. Corin looked at her, then at Caius, then back at her, with an expression that carried 14 months of unasked questions. Later, she said again. They went back through the corridor, through the eastern door, across the open ground to the tree line, and into the cover of the pines without encountering a single guard. 4 minutes and 30 seconds after they had entered. Brennan and Fife appeared from the north, both back in human form, both unhurt. Brennan handed Corin a cloak without comment. Fife had brought a third horse, Maisie noticed, prepared again, before any confirmation that it would be needed. She looked at Caius. He was watching her with those gray eyes, steady and quiet, and he did not say, "I told you it would work," or "we should move," or anything that would have broken the particular weight of the moment. He simply waited, giving her 10 full seconds that belonged entirely to her and her brother. She used them to grip Corin's arm with both hands and press her forehead briefly to his shoulder, and he put one hand over hers and held on, and neither of them said anything at all. Then she straightened. She released him. She turned to face the horses and the road south, and the 9 days remaining before the council convened. "We need to move," she said. "Yes," Caius agreed. They rode. That night, at a way station lodge 2 hours south of the ridge, while Corin slept the deep and helpless sleep of someone finally safe, Maisie sat across the fire from Caius and laid out everything she had: the copied covenant terms, the original letter with the border acquisition seal, the notes she had made in the notary's office, the specific legal clause about heir reaffirmation. He listened without interrupting. He read each document carefully, in order. When he finished, he set them on the table between them and looked at the fire for a moment. "If you appear before the council as the living heir and file the reaffirmation," he said, "and present the evidence of the illegal holding arrangement simultaneously, the testimony about Corin, the acquisition seal, the documented coercion attempt, the council has no legal ground to deny it. The councilors involved will contest it. They are welcome to contest it from a position of having been exposed for running an illegal holding estate and orchestrating the coercion of a covenant heir." He looked at her. "There are 4 families before yours who can testify to the same pattern. I have been collecting those accounts for 7 months. She looked at him across the fire. "You've been building a case." "Yes. And my family's covenant was the last piece. Your presence before the council, with your brother, with the evidence intact, closes the case." He paused. "You are not a piece, Maisie. You are the person this was done to. That is different." She held that for a moment. The fire crackled and shifted. Outside, the wind moved through the trees with that long, low sound she was beginning to associate with the ridge, like the land itself breathing. "After the council," she said carefully, "what happens to the covenant land? It is reaffirmed in your name and your brother's. What you do with it after that is yours to decide. And the councilors will face council tribunal." His voice did not change, but something in it settled into a weight that left no room for doubt. "All of them." She thought about Dorian Vale, about the particular economy of destruction he had participated in. Not the architect. She had accepted that, but not innocent either. A willing instrument is still an instrument of harm. "Dorian Vale," she said. "Will be called to testify before the tribunal," Caius said. "His cooperation determines what follows." She nodded. Once. That was enough. She did not need to be the one to dismantle him. She simply needed it done. She gathered the documents and folded them back into her cloak. Her hands were steady. She noticed that with a quiet kind of satisfaction, the steadiness she had been building, one careful day at a time in Veldrath, finally feeling like it belonged to her, rather than just something she was performing. "Caius," she said. He looked at her. "Thank you." She said it plainly, without softening it or complicating it. "Not for the rescue specifically, for the way you explained things, for not deciding what I needed before asking." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You thought clearly under pressure tonight. You remembered the corridor layout from the map without referencing it once." She almost smiled. "That's not the same as a thank you." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." A pause, brief and careful. "You're welcome, Maisie." She looked at the fire. He looked at the fire. Outside, the wind settled into quiet. The King's Court sat at the heart of the Northern Territories like a stone fist, massive, gray, unapologetic, its towers rising above the surrounding forest land, with the particular arrogance of something built to last longer than the people inside it. Maisie had imagined it. In the abstract way she had imagined most things beyond Veldrath's borders, as distant and unreachable. Standing before its iron gates on a cold morning with frost still white on the cobblestones, and her breath coming in small clouds, she found that it was exactly as imposing as she had expected, and that this somehow made it easier. She had stopped being frightened of things simply because they were large. Corin stood beside her, dressed in clothes Brennan had produced from somewhere. Dark wool, clean, well-fitted enough. He had slept for nearly 12 hours at the way station, and had eaten properly for the first time in 14 months, and had spent the 2-day ride south asking careful questions that she answered as fully as she could, and listening to the parts she couldn't answer with a patience that reminded her painfully of their father. He had not broken down. He had not raged. He had gone very quiet in the particular way that meant he was thinking, and she had let him think, and by the time they reached the court's outer road, he had told her, simply and without drama, that he was ready. She believed him. Caius had ridden slightly ahead, as he had for most of the journey, but he slowed now and came level with her at the gate. He looked at her, a brief and steady glance that asked a question without words. She gave him the smallest nod. He turned and spoke to the gate guard, and the iron doors opened. The council chamber was a long room with a vaulted stone ceiling and tall windows that admitted pale winter light in long rectangles across the floor. 6 council seats lined the far wall, all occupied. At the center of the room, a standing space marked in the old tradition, with a circle of dark stone set into the pale floor. The place where those who came to testify stood. Maisie walked to the circle and stood in it. She was aware of the room the way she was always aware of rooms, the smell of it first, old stone and beeswax, and the faint metallic cold of iron sconces. The weight of the ceiling, the quality of the silence, which was the specific silence of people who were accustomed to deciding things and were waiting to do so again. She was also aware that 3 of the 6 council members had gone very still at the sight of her, in the way that people go still when they see something they were not prepared for. She recognized one of them, the older counselor from the Iron Lantern, the one who had sat beside Dorian and watched her leave, so he would know which road to follow. He recognized her too. She could see it in the way the stillness reached his face, a half-second after it reached his hands. She looked away from him and addressed the council head, an older woman with silver-streaked hair and the unhurried manner of someone who had presided over this room for a very long time. "My name is Maisie Voss," she said. "My father was Aldrin Voss, registered holder of the Veldrath Pact Covenant. I am his surviving heir, and I am here to file a reaffirmation of that covenant under Article 9 of the Territorial Charter." She reached into her cloak and placed the copied covenant terms on the clerk's table to her right. "I am also here to present evidence of a coordinated illegal coercion arrangement targeting covenant heirs across the northern border territories, of which my family was the most recent intended victim." The silence in the room changed quality entirely. She continued. She spoke for 20 minutes without stopping. She presented the documents in the order she and Caius had organized them the previous evening: the border acquisition seal from Dorian's letter, the covenant terms, the records she had copied at Aldrich's office, the account of armed men on the Ridge Road, the evidence of Holt Crossing as an unauthorized holding estate. Then Corin stepped forward and gave his own testimony. 14 months, documented, precise, delivered in the same quiet and unbreakable voice he had used for the entire ride south. Then Caius presented 7 months of compiled evidence: 4 families, 4 dissolved covenants, 4 sets of legal testimony gathered across the territories, all pointing to the same network of counselors using the same mechanism to absorb land that did not belong to them. The 3 counselors who had gone still at Maisie's entrance did not remain still throughout this process. They objected twice. The council head overruled them. Twice, with the calm efficiency of someone removing splinters. At the end of the 3rd hour, the council head called for a recess of 1 hour to review the compiled evidence. Maisie walked out of the circle and stood near the tall window at the side of the room, looking out at the frost-white courtyard below. Her legs were steady. Her hands were steady. She felt more than anything an enormous and unfamiliar quiet in her chest. Not peace exactly. Not yet. But the absence of the low, constant dread that had lived there for so long, she had stopped noticing it. The way you stop noticing a sound that never changes. Caius came to stand beside her at the window. Not close. The appropriate distance of someone who was present without presuming. "You didn't look at your notes once," he said. "I didn't need to. I wrote them. I know what they say." She looked at the courtyard. "I've been carrying this for 3 years without knowing what it was. It turns out the shape of it was always the same. I just couldn't see it from inside." A brief silence. "What happens to the counselors?" she asked. "The tribunal convenes within the fortnight. The evidence is sufficient for formal charges on all counts: illegal detention, coercion of covenant heirs, unauthorized land acquisition, conspiracy." He paused. "The man from the Iron Lantern, Counselor Draven, has already asked to speak privately with the council head. That is what cooperation looks like when it comes. And Dorian was brought in this morning by Brennan and Fife. He is in a council holding room." Caius's voice remained even. "He has agreed to testify fully in exchange for reduced charges. His testimony corroborates everything you presented. He was, as we assessed, a collector, not an architect. He will face consequences, but not the same ones." She considered that. She had thought she might feel something more when the moment arrived, some release or satisfaction. What she felt instead was simply that it was right. The appropriate outcome for the shape of what had happened. No more and no less. "Good," she said. The council reconvened after the hour. The reaffirmation was granted. The Veldrath Covenant, in the names of Maisie Voss and Corin Voss, was entered into the territorial record with full legal standing. The 3 counselors were formally suspended pending tribunal. The other member of their network, 2 additional senior wolves whose names had appeared in Caius's compiled evidence, were summoned to appear before the council within the week. The council head signed the reaffirmation document and handed it to Maisie directly. It was a piece of parchment, heavy, cream-colored, covered in formal language and official seals. Maisie held it in both hands and looked at her father's name printed in the record above her own, and allowed herself, just for a moment, to feel the full weight of what it meant. He had built something real. It had been taken from him piece by piece before he had the chance to protect it. And now it was back. Not because someone had given it to her out of charity, but because she had walked into a notary's office at dawn and copied the right documents, and had not signed what she was not supposed to sign, and had followed a black wolf through a dark forest when every reasonable instinct said to run the other way. She folded the document carefully and placed it inside her cloak. The courtyard was empty in the late afternoon. The frost long melted, the stones pale and dry in the thin winter sun. Corin had gone with Brennan to arrange horses and provisions for the journey back to Veldrath. There were decisions to make about the Covenant land, none of them urgent, all of them theirs to make at whatever pace they chose. Fife had gone to send word to the 4 families whose accounts had formed the core of the case, so that they might know the tribunal was coming. Maisie stood alone in the courtyard for a moment and looked up at the sky. Pale blue, very clear. The kind of sky that appeared only in the coldest part of autumn, when the air had been scoured clean by weeks of wind, and the world looked more precise than usual, every edge sharper than it had any right to be. She heard his step on the stone behind her, and did not turn. "You could have told me who you were," she said. "That first night, in the forest." "Yes," Caius said. He came to stand beside her, looking up at the same sky. "I chose not to." "Why?" A pause. "Because I wanted you to make your own assessment. Not of the Alpha King, of me." Another pause, brief and careful, the kind he seemed to use when choosing words with particular precision. "There is a difference. It matters to me that there is a difference." She thought about the hunting lodge, the maps, the way he had answered her questions without impatience, the door he had stayed near, giving her the room. "I know," she said. "That's why I followed your wolf." The silence between them was the comfortable kind, the kind that didn't need filling. A pair of birds crossed the pale sky above the courtyard, moving south together with the particular directness of creatures that knew exactly where they were going. She was not the same person who had stood at the ridge marker 2 days ago, choosing a road with nothing in her pockets but a copied document and a refusal to be used. She would not be that person again. She was not sure yet who she was becoming, only that the becoming had started, and that it felt nothing like the slow erosion of the last 3 years. It felt like ground returning beneath her feet. "The Covenant land," she said. "Corin and I will go back, rebuild what we can." She glanced at him. "I imagine you have a kingdom to return to." "I do." He looked at her steadily. "It is not, however, going anywhere." She held that for a moment. The meaning in it, which was not a promise exactly, but was something adjacent to one, offered without pressure, without expectation, simply placed before her the way he placed everything before her. As a fact, clearly stated, hers to do with as she chose. "Neither," she said. "Am I?" Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile precisely, but the thing that lived just beneath one. In the particular stillness of a face that was not accustomed to being easy, and was, just now, something close to it. He inclined his head once. She looked back at the sky. 6 months later, the tribunal concluded. Councillor Draven and his 2 co-conspirators received formal dissolution of their council standing and territorial exile. The harshest sentence available under pack law outside of execution, and one that left them stripped of every authority they had spent decades accumulating. The other 2 members of the network received lesser sentences in exchange for full cooperation. All 5 families whose covenants had been targeted received formal restitution acknowledgments entered into the territorial record, though what had been taken from 3 of them could not be fully returned. Some losses, Maisie knew, did not have remedies, only acknowledgement. Dorian Vale testified for 3 days before the tribunal. His account corroborated every element of the case. He was stripped of his commission as a territorial agent and fined heavily, the fines directed to a restitution fund for the affected families. He left the Northern Territories afterward and did not return. Maisie did not watch him go. She had already closed that door. The Veldrath Covenant land came back to life slowly, the way things that have been left untended do. Not all at once, not dramatically, but with the stubborn persistence of roots